Hello. Hello, Mesut.
Hi, Avanish. How are you?
Me fine, and you?
I'm good, thanks.
Okay, so let me introduce you to the audience. Today we are with Mesut Durukal. Maybe you already know him because there was a talk on the last Heisenbug about robots, and now Mesut returns to for us with a new awesome talk. All right, Mesut, could you introduce yourself again?
Of course, my pleasure. Yeah, as you told last year as well, I have given a talk in Heisenbug, and I love this conference. I'm very happy to be here. And I'm originally from Turkey, but I'm based in Japan. So there is a little bit time difference between us. So greetings to Russia and all the other audience from anywhere they are joining. And I'm a test automation engineer, and I'm dealing with automating and implementing some test cases and running them to ensure the quality in our product. So today we will a little bit talk about doing this in an efficient way by removing the duplication or encouraging the reusability. So we will talk about writing reusable test cases.
Okay, so good luck. But before we start, I should say, should notify you, audience, about chat. So there is a chat. You can write your messages to Mesut and me. And after the talk, we will have a time for questions. So we will answer on all questions. And what else? There is a rating. Yes, there is a rating for the talk. As I know, there are 5 stars, if I'm not mistaken. So you can vote for the talk, and it will go higher, higher, higher in the top because talk is really awesome. So, Mesut, it's your time. We could start, right?
Yes, thank you so much, Avinir. So let's get started. So, as I briefly told, we will talk about writing reusable test cases because I believe this is an important topic. We will discuss about removing the duplication and writing reusable test cases because it affects the efficiency of test automation. Nowadays, we are mostly doing test automation because trying to perform our quality assurance activities, verification and validation activities with only manual test cases is not easy. We need automation because every day we are having some new commits, we are pushing our code to repository to be deployed into production. But of course, after every change or after every commit, we have to ensure that these changes do not break the working functionality. So to do this continuous testing after every time, if we run the test cases, of course, the reliability or the efficiency of test cases is very important. So one way to improve the efficiency is writing reusable test cases. What does it mean? Whenever we implement one test case, we can execute the same test case without changing the code in lots of different configuration. For example, if I have 5 different websites which I test, I can run these test cases on different websites without changing the code. I will just pass some arguments. I will just provide some execution configurations, and the same code will do the verification activities for different verification activities and for different websites. So we will see how it works. But the flow of the talk will be like this. First of all, I will a little bit do an introduction about, go a little bit more deep into duplication and reusability and the importance of them. And then in the second part, I will remind you some key features, how we can implement those features. So these features or the functionalities are provided by most of the test automation frameworks because whenever we are developing our test automation environment, we can utilize different libraries or different frameworks. So whatever or whichever you use, most of the time you will have these functionalities. But just to have a better understanding, just to have some concrete examples, I will share some code snippets, and they are taken from Cypress. Cypress is one of the most used E2E test automation frameworks. But again, the configs, the hooks, the helper classes, all the examples that I'll share from Cypress is also applicable in other test automation frameworks as well. For example, even if you are using Python, you can still use these functionalities all the hooks, configs you can still use, or Playwright or any other library or framework you can still use. And in the last part, in the third part, I will do a quick demo. I think that there will be no time for live coding, so at least I will show how these functionalities can be applied to a website or a testing activity. But even if we don't have too much time to do a live coding, I will leave a link in which I do the live coding, so you can just go after the talk and check how it works. So let's get started before leaving or losing more time. The first part, the introduction. So why are we talking about this reusability or the duplication? Because we have lots of different challenges in software testing. Nowadays, testing is not easy. We are trying to test very complex and complicated applications. They are running in different platforms. Nowadays, the users are not using only the PCs, only the desktop devices, but also they are using some mobile devices as well. And they are not using only one specific browser, but they are changing between different browsers. So we have to execute lots of different configurations. This is one thing. And other than this, we are working in agile practices. We are not doing waterfall anymore. Not that much. So this means we are very open for changes. In Agile, if there is a change request coming from the customers, we are very welcoming that. We are very open for applying the changes. But this means we have to update test cases accordingly. Because if the behaviors or the specifications that we are changing, testing is changed or updated, and if we do not update our test cases, then we would be testing a wrong scope, right? Because the behavior already changed. So we have to update our expected results or the expected conditions. So we have to continuously maintain test cases. Even without any change, sometimes we have some failures from the tests. For example, we execute our suite and some of the test cases fail. Why? Because maybe there is some bug in the product. It is a real bug. But sometimes that is not the case, which means sometimes the failure is not a real bug. The product is working as expected. The product is working properly, but the test case is failing due to some test smells. So I have left lots of different test smell types on this slide. Please do not read all of them because there's a huge list. If you go and do a literature survey, you will find dozens of hundreds of test smell types. There are a lot of test smells we can have in our automation environment. So it is very high likely to have some test smells. So whenever we have some false alarms, some test failures, which is not stemming from the product, but the weaknesses from the test code, then we have to fix our test cases, right? We have to get rid of those test smells. So in this regard, sometimes we have to do the continuous maintenance and apply our fixes in which the classes or the functions that we want to change. But if we have some duplication, for example, let's go over a concrete example. I have a login operation, for example. Before navigating through the web pages, first of all, I have to log in. I have to provide my credentials or the tokens. And if the developer team changes the login algorithm or the login approach, I'm not supposed to give my credentials anymore, but I'm supposed to attach an access token to my request. Then I have to change the function which is doing the login operation. So if I'm doing login in every test spec file, I have to change every individual test spec file. It will be a huge maintenance effort. But instead, I have only one class. And in that class, I have the login function. And from the spec files, I'm just calling the function. Then what I have to do is only going to the relevant class and changing the relevant function. Only one function will be changed. I don't have to change all the spec files because they are only calling the function. And one more concrete example from the real life scenario. In my organization, we are developing some job seeker websites, which means we are posting some jobs descriptions, and the job seekers, anyone tries to do some job queries, go to these websites and perform some queries by providing some keywords. For example, I want to search all the jobs in Moscow city with the keyword engineer or IT engineer, let's say test engineer. After I provide these queries, I click the search button and I go to the relevant query. I see the list. But we have a couple of websites, because they have also they all have the same functionality. On each of them you can do some job queries, but they are different websites, because one of them is only for students, for example. They have only the part-time jobs. The other is for another major, like only for the teachers, and the other has some jobs for a different geographical region. For example, one operates in Japan, one operates in India. So the target or the scope is different, but the functionality is same. So I have to test different websites. For example, Townwork, From A, or Rikunabe Next. Those are different websites, but there is one test case which is performing a query and showing the list on each of these websites. So what I can do is I can execute or implement only one test case, and this test case should be reusable on all of these websites. This is one example from my real life scenario. This happened in my real life project. Not only websites, but also some different configuration we want to cover. For example, we have some development stages. For example, first of all, we deploy our code to dev stage, and then we have the QA, and then finally the prod. So sometimes we want to execute our test cases in different stages. And then we have to, or we want to execute our test cases both in desktop and mobile version, different platforms, and on different browsers. Sometimes we are running on Chrome, sometimes on Safari, sometimes Firefox. So we can change the configuration, but the test code is still the same. We don't change the code itself. We just change the configuration or the execution parameters, the arguments. So we will see how it works. So before going to a real life demonstration, first of all, let's a little bit remember what kind of functionalities we can utilize from the test automation frameworks. But before going through one by one the functionalities, let me show you the general architecture. So what I want is, I have multiple applications. On the slide we can see on the top. So all these different applications have different code repositories. They can execute in their pipelines the test executions. But I don't want to replicate, I don't have to duplicate my test repository. I have test repository only once in one place. So the first principle that I will apply is, if I implement some reusable workflows are the jobs which are developed in GitHub Actions. But if you are using Jenkins or GitLab Runner or GitHub Actions, whatever you are using for your CI/CD pipelines, you can still implement some reusable workflows or reusable jobs. After the jobs are triggered, then the test runner starts. The test runner, first of all, generates an execution scope, because we have lots of different test cases, but maybe we won't execute all of them, right? We will select a subset. Some of them we will include, some of them we will exclude. So test runner, first of all, scans all the test spec files and includes the test cases that we want to execute in that suite. So it selects the relevant test cases. After the test cases are selected, and we already know the execution suite, the first code which runs in the test automation framework is the test hooks, which is before all or before suite function and before each, which means before all runs only once before the test suite, but before each runs before every individual test case. So these hooks runs before the test itself starts. This is already one great way to do the improve the reusability or removing the duplication, because if there is some code which is repeated in all the test steps, I don't have to implement those steps inside the test. I can just move to the hook, and if I start the test, these hooks will already be automatically triggered. So before all and before each will execute for each test execution. So after that, the test itself starts, and it already triggers a relevant browser. Whatever browser we are selecting, the relevant driver or the browser itself starts, and we can see the test steps are running. We can run both in headed or the headless mode. So sometimes we don't see the browser at all. The whole process is performed in the background, but we can select the headed execution as well. In that case, we will see what's happening on the browser itself. And after the whole execution is completed, the last step is just reporting all the results to the dashboard. This is very important in terms of visibility. In this way, we can see even after the execution, what happened. We can reach out all the execution details, like which test case passed, which test case failed, what is the execution duration, the total execution duration, or the execution duration for each test case. We can investigate from the dashboard. And we can see what kind of flakiness we have, which test cases failed, but after the retries, maybe they start passing again. This means maybe we have some flaky test cases. So this is the overall depiction of the test automation environment. We will see what kind of features we can use to have this environment. But before still moving on, let me show you one code example as well. This is a very simple test spec file, just 2 lines, not a complex scenario, very simple scenario. In the first line, by ignoring the log steps or log lines, we have only 2 lines. In the first one, we just basically find the keyword input, which is a text field, and clear it because maybe there's already some queries over there, and then type our random query, like engineer or IT jobs. I'm passing a keyword to the text field. And then after typing this, my expectation is seeing some auto-completion options. Like, as you know, when we are using the search engines like Google or Yandex or any other, whenever we start typing, we already see some auto-completion options, right? So this is the same behavior. In my site, whenever I start typing some queries into text field, I want to see some auto-completion options. So these are the 2 lines that I will execute in this test case. So how can I execute this test case? I will pass my execution commands. But this will run the relevant spec file. But of course, there are some other arguments. For example, I can select my browser as well. So I can pass the relevant browser. So if I pass Edge, then the test will start on Edge browser. Or likewise, I can execute on the other browsers as well. So similarly, I can select the application that I want to test, or I can select the stage that I want to go, or even I can select the execution platform on which I want to execute these test cases. So in this, checking all this configuration, finally, I can understand that the same test code, only 2 lines, can run in 48 different configurations. So let's already get started investigating some functionalities that I can use to have this perfect test automation environment in which I can execute the same test code in lots of different configurations. So the first functionality I want to share with you is the configuration, test configuration. So for this, in all test automation environments, generally we manage the configuration with a config file. So it is most of the time a JSON file, and I have a config file, and from this config file, I can do lots of different settings. I can set in which folder I will keep my fixture, in which folder I will keep my plugins, or what will be the retry number, how many times I will do the retries, or will I enable the video capturing, which means even after the test execution is completed, I want to see the video of all the pages, or maybe just the screenshots. So all these settings can be done with the configuration. But there is one more thing that I can introduce in the config file, which is the custom environmental variables. So on this config file, on the left-hand side, we can see in the second line, there's a env variable. And in this way, I can introduce a custom variable. For example, I can set a value or key, which is my key or my app, and I can set some default values. So in this way, when I run the test by selecting this config file, then I can reach out to these environmental variables and I can utilize these values. For example, when I read my environmental variables, then I can already integrate these values into my code. First I can read the config, which can be done in Cypress, but by cypress.env function, which can be seen on this slide in the last line. And after reading this with .env function, I can read all these values. And when we are running the test execution, we can pass some other arguments as browser or the spec, as we've seen in the previous slide. So after the configuration, the next functionality I want to show you is the hooks, again, which we a little bit briefly discussed in the previous slides. So these are the before or after functions running in every execution. So even if we don't include any specific steps inside the test, if we already have some steps inside this before or before each, or after each functions, then these are automatically triggered. For example, let's suppose I have a test suite, and in the suite I have 3 test cases, let's say. So once I will see before is running, and then 3 times I see before each is running. First, before each runs for the first test case, and then the first test itself runs, and the before each runs for the second test, and the second test itself is executed. So in this way, the execution is completed, and then similarly, we are seeing after every single test case, and once after the whole suite is completed. Again, this is a good way to move the repeated steps to these hook files. And one more beautiful feature that Cypress supports is you can define some global hooks. You can introduce these hooks into an index.js file. But even if you can still have your own before and before each into a spec file as well. So you can both have the global hooks and the global hook inside the spec as well. You can have both. So in this time, first the global hook will run, and then the hook inside the test spec file will execute, and then finally the test case itself will execute. Moving on, one other functionality that we can utilize is, of course, introducing some classes or the functions. Because if you want to implement all the steps inside the spec files, there will be a duplication, right? For example, let's suppose I'm taking some screenshots, or maybe I'm parsing the response coming from the request, and then I'm parsing a relevant value, and I'm attaching this value as a token to my request. Let's suppose this is a part of the scenario that I want to execute. So I can introduce a function for this, and I can name this function as attach the relevant value, let's say. This is my function, attach the relevant value. So I can already call this function from the test classes instead of implementing these steps each time in each test spec file. So for this, I can already create some different classes in maybe some different folders. And after exporting these functions, I can already import the implemented functions into my spec files. In this way, I will be removing or eliminating all the duplications. So one other thing that we can do to implement good practices, or while we are doing the test implementation, just to follow some good practices or to avoid some anti-patterns, we should really consider following some approaches to properly handle or to properly manage the locators. So what does the locators mean? Whenever we are doing the front-end automation or the UI automation, basically what we are doing when we are doing the manual testing, we just locate the elements visually, right? For example, when I'm typing some queries into text field, first of all, visually, with my eyes, I see where the text box is, on the top of the page, or in the middle, or maybe at the bottom. I am visually locating it. So similarly, if I want to do the automated testing, I should let PC know where this element is. After PC knows where it is, then it can interact with. So the principle to automate the front-end testing is, first of all, we should locate the elements, and then after we locate them, we can interact with them. What kind of interactions we can do? Like we can click to the buttons, or other clickable elements, or maybe we can clear the text fields, or we can type in them, or if there is a selectable element like list items or drop down menus, we can select them or unselect them, or we can check or uncheck if it is radio button or something else. These are the interactions. And eventually, after we locate and do the interactions, eventually we do our assertions, which means we can check some values, or we can check the length of the elements, or we can check maybe the numbers inside, or the labels inside the text fields, or the other elements on the page. But to do that, if we are managing the locators not in a good way, then the UI test cases can be broken frequently, because most of the time we can use different class names or the paths of the element in the page. And if the developer team changes the layout of the UI page, then the locators can be broken. So what we can do is we can use some unique IDs. For example, it can be the ID itself, or maybe it can be the test data ID. So somehow, instead of using the class names or the class path, or maybe just having some uh, like absolute path, just using some IDs will make life easier for us. Even if they change the layout, then the unique ID will be still there. So even if the layout is changed, my test case will not be broken. So what I can use is, of course, I can pass the tag name, which is the type of the element, if it is a label or if it is an input element or a button. And then I can pass some attributes, like I can pass the type or value or the name of the element, and by passing the relevant value, the UI automation will find, which means will locate the element that I'm looking for. So this was a quick reminder about the functionalities that we can use in test automation, and implementing the automation in a good way. So let's see how it works in a real life example. So we will go through a simple scenario. This time it will not be the live coding, but again, I will remind you, I will leave a link, a barcode, so you can scan to see the live coding. In that way, you can see step by step how I implement all these lines. But in this talk, it is not a workshop, it is just a talk. So I will show all the lines, just present them. So let's get started. This is the scenario that I want to implement, in which I navigate to a web page and I find the text field, input value, and then after typing something, I will click the search button. This is the scenario. Again, a simple scenario, not a complex and complicated. It is a short and simple scenario. Let's implement this. How can we start? So this is the first implementation that I have done. This is my starting point. Okay, but I will leave just maybe 5 seconds for you, just to have a look into this code. What kind of weaknesses or what kind of potential risks do you see? Please have a look on this code and try to figure out potential risks. Okay, I think after 5 seconds, you already realize there are some potential risks, and there is already some duplication, right? Because in the second line and in the third line, I see that there is some locators which is first passing the tag name, which is the div, and then input, and passing some attribute, which is the name is expected to be a Q. But this is repeated in both line 2 and 3. So we are talking about only one spec file. So think about, you have 100 test spec files. You will have lots of different duplication. So let's start improving the reusability and removing the duplication. So what we can do is, instead of having the magical values or the embedded hard-coded values inside the test spec file, we can already replace these values by some variables. So we can declare these variables by some keywords, and then we can move all these variables to some constant class. So if we create a constant classes, then we can call these constants from lots of different spec files. So this is the first replacement I will do. Instead of using the locators inside the spec file, I will just collect them into another file. So in the traditional implementation approach, you already know this is called as page object model. But in the modern E2E test automation frameworks, it's a little bit different. It is not in the same way exactly, but works in a very similar fashion. So the basic idea is same. Instead of putting all the locators inside the test class or the test spec file, I'm just collecting them into another class. So I'm just calling them. This is the first thing that I did. And the second thing is, let me go back to remind you how the URL looks like. So the first line is just like this, right? I'm visiting a web page. But if I use in this way, I can test only one application, but I want to navigate to multiple applications without changing the code. If I code in this way, it will always go to the same URL. So what I can do is I can generate my URL in a dynamic way, which is depending on the configuration parameters that I'm passing through the config file or through the console, which I attach to my execution command. So in this way, the main page variable that I will visit can be generated after I pass some config values. So it will be, if I pass my application environmental variable as some value like charisma, then the main page will be charisma.something.com. But if I pass my app as Workopolis, then the main page will be workopolis.something.com. So the main page that I visit will be generated dynamically. So you see, we already start to utilize the config values, the config parameters. Moving on. So far we only discussed about the global configs, which is managed with a config file or from the console arguments. But we can set some configs to the test itself as well, which is called the test config. So basically, let me quickly go to the next slide. It will be better understandable in this way. So this is an example in which I set some test configs. For example, in this one, I set the test ID to a variable and platform to another key and priority and some other keys I'm setting as a test config. In this way, every individual test case I can execute on different platforms. For example, this test, I can set platform as mobile. So this test case can execute on mobile, but the next test, I can set platform as desktop. So the next test will be executed in desktop. You get the idea. I have two test cases. One of them, I'm setting the test config as mobile. So this test case will execute on mobile. The second test, I'm setting the platform as desktop. So that will execute on desktop. So even if I start the whole execution, inside the whole execution, one test case will execute on mobile, the next test case will execute on desktop. This is one of the very strong functionalities which Cypress support. So we can set individual test configs, which will differentiate between different test cases. So in this case, we can execute in different platforms, including the mobile. So most of the time, the applications that we are testing are responsive, which means if we change the viewport, which means if we change the window size of the application that we are running, then we will be already testing the mobile version. But sometimes it is not. Sometimes the application is not responsive. Even if I change the window size, then maybe it is still going to the desktop version. So what should I do? I should add some custom headers. For example, if I set my user agent to a mobile value, then I will be doing the real mobile version testing. So for this, there is one more function that I can use, which is the Cypress intercept. So in this way, even in Cypress, it is called as intercept. In Playwright, it is something else. But again, I'm repeating myself. In all the test automation frameworks that you use or the libraries that you use, there is another way of doing this. So the way of doing this can be different, but the principle is same. We are just trying to utilize different functionalities or different implementation ways to improve our reusability. So in this way, we can change the request. The intercept first catches the request to be sent to the server, and before sending, before sending, just do the modification. Like if we wanna add some other custom headers like user agent or anything else, then do the modification, and then send the request. Same can be done for the responses as well. We can catch the response coming from the servers, and then do the mocking for our test automation activities. And one more thing that we can do is, if we don't want to start different executions inside the same execution, we can loop, we can iterate through different execution parameter lists. For example, if I pass all the platforms on which I want to execute my test cases as a list, then I can iterate my execution over this list. So for each, I will start my test case, and in each of them, the platform will be set accordingly. In this case, I'm passing a list, which is the first item is the desktop and the second is mobile. So in the first execution, the platform will be desktop, and in the second one, it will be mobile. So this was, I guess, the last example that I want to share. And as I promised before, I'm leaving a barcode here in which you can scan, and you can see the implementation of all these lines that I already shared. Because in this presentation, I shared some code which was already previously implemented. But one by one, if you are interested in going through those implementation steps, please visit and see. And apart from that, I'm leaving some socials here. If you have any questions, please do not reach out to me, or just feel free to get connected over these socials. And if we have time now, of course, I will be more than happy to go over the questions if you have any.
Thanks a lot, Mesut. Very reusable talk, I think. So I think I will go with this talk to my QA department. What next? Next, we can answer other questions, but as I see, the all discussion is around ChatGPT and subtitles. Anyway, so we can proceed, and I should notify that you can rank, you can rate this talk. I mean, stars under the talk, and I think that's all. Mesut, what are you planning to talk on the next Heisenbug?
I'm sorry, next edition?
Yes, maybe something else, maybe some new theme.
Yeah. Of course. There is a lot of topics that we can talk about. So hopefully we can meet again to discuss about another topic.
Okay, and I see the message. Thank you. I want to try now. Thank you. So a lot of pleasure from the audience, and I hope I will see you personally on the next Heisenbug. It will be great.
I hope so. Yes, sure. That would be great.
Okay, so if there are no questions, and only thank you. So thanks a lot, and see you again on the next Heisenbug. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. My pleasure.
Bye.